Patreon or Patreoff? That's my question for you today. Welcome and thank you, of course, for joining me for this bonus MxTRA video tied to Season 7, Episode 5 about audio files. And this bonus MxTRA video is the truth about vinyl. Everybody talks about it. It's got a mystical appeal at this point. I'm going to tell you some truth. Sources, first of all, huge credit to the YouTube channel Real Engineering and the dude's video called The Truth About Vinyl, Vinyl versus Digital. Huge credit. Also, Wikipedia, as usual, audiosciencereview.com is another one. So the reason why this is the bonus MxTRA video, two reasons. One, I got a bone to pick. And two, audio files are very often linked to vinyl, so it seemed appropriate to link it to the main episode on audio files. And though the term audiophile was coined in 1951, 3 years after vinyl was invented, vinyl wasn't enough of a presence for that to be a part of the mix at the time, until several years later. In truth, the term refers more to people who spend a lot of money on equipment to get what they believe is a far superior listening experience. That's what the main episode was about. But let's be honest, when most of us hear that word today, really, we think of people who revere and prefer vinyl to any other format. It has become so closely associated to vinyl. So this bonus MxTRA video will break that down and get to the truth about vinyl, meaning is it superior to all other formats? And to do that, we have to level the playing field. We have to have a control. So let's set aside how something was recorded by assuming whatever abstract piece of music we're using as an example was written, performed, recorded, and produced optimally. Let's just say whatever it is. There's no variation. And to satisfy any audiophile tendency in you, let's assume the music was recorded on analog equipment even. I'll go as far as that. Doesn't matter. Whatever. You think of it how you want. But make the conditions the same for either or. I'm not going to go into why it doesn't ultimately matter whether it was recorded on analog equipment either. Maybe I'll mention it a little bit. But that's not really what this one's about. So let's line up the format options available to us today, or say at least in the last 30 years. Vinyl, cassettes, 8-tracks sort of, but really vinyl and cassettes, CDs, waves, and MP3s. I'm assuming most people don't use or care about or know AIFFs and other digital formats. Of course, waves and MP3s also represent not just downloads, but streaming. So digital in every form. So vinyl, cassettes, CDs, waves, MP3s. And there's a reason why I make a difference between the two and not just say digital. Of the first, the first two are analog, vinyl and cassettes. Both have sonic artifacts, meaning there's imperfections there that come with the package. For vinyl, it's the action of the needle on the record, as well as usually some hiss or empty space, the amount of data that can be stored on a vinyl. For cassettes, it's also the cassette hiss. It's the tape warp. It's the way the rollers rub against the tape and what have you. Some tape warp meaning just slight changes in speed sometimes. Even though I myself prefer cassettes, both for their portability and the sonic artifacts, I just like, I often, not often, but I sometimes put tape warp on my recordings on purpose to get that effect. I've also done the vinyl scratches on some of my recordings too, but I prefer cassettes. But I can say, even though I prefer cassettes, that of those two, vinyl is superior. It's cleaner, it lasts longer. This doesn't account for DAT, digital audio tape, which is better quality than both. I'm not going to get into that because nobody really, that's not a consumer thing, So far, if we're making a bracket, March Madness in November, October, whatever, vinyl wins over cassettes in head-to-head combat. The last three formats, CD, waves, and MP3s are all digital, regardless of how the music was actually recorded. If it was recorded analog, you're listening to it digitally, right? So my heart is still with CDs because the physicality of being able to open it and whatever. But those can have variable sound depending on how they were duplicated, how they were manufactured, how much music they tried to squeeze onto one CD. The more you squeeze, the more compressed the music is, right? So as mentioned in my digital music format bonus MxTRA video, which hopefully you saw, waves have about 10 times the data as MP3s. which are basically compressed versions of waves or other high-res audio formats. So of those three, of waves, CDs, and MP3s, waves win because unlike CDs, they have a more tightly controlled, range of quality, let's say, than CDs do. So now we have our two contenders, head-to-head, finals. Vinyl and waves, essentially analog and digital. So the standard argument is that vinyl is just warmer than digital. And first of all, this is almost entirely perception and not fact. And it's often based on what kind of music you're listening to. As vinyl lovers tend to listen to music that was recorded and produced with more mid-range tones, say in the 70s, aka warmer. And yes, I said it's almost entirely perception because the fact of warmth is actually one of the artifacts or imperfections of vinyl. And I do respect people who love imperfections, I do not prefer them over a lack of imperfections in the format, but I like them in many ways, like I said. What the truth is, vinyl doesn't have the room to capture the full range of sounds, especially of today's recorded music, which has much more data than music recorded prior. Because louder sounds like booming bass need more space on a recording, and things are much more bass heavy than they used to be. You hear old disco songs and you're like, where's the bass? And then they remaster it and you're like, there's the bass. Vinyl tends toward that warmer end for all these reasons. Plus, like with the tape warp and hiss that comes from the rollers the tape goes through, vinyl comes with a natural rumble, the needle in the groove, further giving the impression that the music itself is warmer when it's actually the format. But before we get too much into that, let's talk about human biology and our ears, which, by the way, it's not a very long video, but I want to get into it. A theory was proposed in 1928 and proven 21 years later that to recreate an analog wave digitally, we only need to sample it a minimum of twice, which produces a sample rate of 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. And the reason why this was proven is because the maximum the human ears can detect is 20,000 hertz. So, however, and I don't know enough about science, so you think of an analog wave as this, smooth, up and down, right? If you've ever seen one, I'm sure you have. A digital wave is, and this is what the perception, I'll talk about this later, is misperception. It goes like this. It'll never be, no matter how tiny those right angles are, it'll never be a smooth wave. But this study showed that if you just sample each wave twice, you have all the data you need for the human ear. 20,000 hertz. Keep that number in mind. Which means human ears have limitations. And we'll find out in a bit how or if they compromise our listening experience when we switch formats. But before that, some more numbers. It's been said that vinyl can reach up to 100,000 hertz. But since both the base standards of the RIAA, Recording Industry Association of America, I believe, and speakers in general almost all top out at 20,000 hertz, not to mention the human ear can't discern anything beyond that. Anything above that number is useless, so 100,000 is a pointless number. As mentioned, louder sounds take up more space because vinyl space is limited. Sounds generally need to stay in the 20 to 40 dB range to fit on an album. Some have reached 80 dB, but very rarely. Look it up if you don't know what it means, because I don't know if I do, frankly. I mean, I do, but I couldn't describe it. The dynamic range of a CD can go up to 150 dB, so almost twice that of an album and more than really 4 times that of an average album. And when you translate that to digital formats like waves, there are much higher limitations to the amount of data you can store, so much higher that it doesn't make a difference to the human ears. I mean, right. Speaking of those limitations, and that number 20,000, I ask you to remember, here's a fact that might put the final nail in the coffin of whether or not vinyl is better. Digital and analog waveforms differ in the way I mentioned with my finger, which is an analog waveform is smooth. It includes all the spaces in between, up and down, all the way through. A digital waveform is jagged, creating ever-shrinking kind of half-lives of right angles between the spaces, but never filling in all the gaps. So this has caused many people to believe that we're missing something because physically or whatever, physiologically, whatever it is, in terms of science, there is missing data there because of those gaps. But the fact that seals the deal goes back to the 20,000 number. Waves and other high-res digital formats are produced at a minimum of 44,100 hertz. That's a number that musicians who record know very well. Sometimes we go up to 48, but the industry standard is 44.1. Anyone, yeah, exactly. Also 16-bit or 24-bit, those are numbers that recording musicians know a lot. The standard is 44,100 hertz and 16-bit, right? But you can go 24, etc. If you're going to upload CD Baby or DistroKid, you got to make it 44,100 and 16-bit. That's what they accept. Even if vinyl and other analog sound can be as fine-tuned as to reach 100,000 hertz, the human ear can't detect beyond 20,000 hertz, meaning even high-res digital music, which again goes to 44,100 hertz or sometimes 48,000 hertz, has qualities the human ear can't even detect. This means those so-called missing pieces from the jagged wave of a digital wave, they don't matter. We're not really experientially missing a damn thing. And in fact, digital recording can ultimately fit far more audio data than vinyl ever could or will. So the winner of which is the superior format in terms of quality, it's digital, hands down. I'm sorry. You like your artifacts, you like your imperfections, you like your idiosyncrasies, you like the experience of putting on a vinyl record, fine. But it's just not better than digital. It's not. And cassettes aren't either, as much as I love cassettes. Some postscript comments. The majority of our modern day listening experience, regardless of how you listen, is slightly inferior. Why? Because unless you are just not a streamer, you don't like Spotify, Apple, you don't even go to YouTube, and you only stick with the high-end streamings like Tidal or Qobuz or other high-end streaming services, you're listening in general, Spotify, Apple, whatever, to highly compressed MP3 versions of recordings, compressed in a way that you couldn't control. They're not even as high quality as homegrown MP3s. MP3s are, again, can compress to 10 times smaller than waves, but within that, there are different qualities based on bit rate. So with 128 kilobytes per second, whatever, considered the bare minimum for a good enough quality MP3, you can go as low as 16. You can compress the shit out of it, or as high as 320 kbps. Waves range from around 350 kbps to 9,000. Clearly superior. Spotify and Apple compress their music much the way MP3s are compressed and tend towards the 96 to 160 kbps range. So getting to decent, but not great. But if your speakers and ears and environment are good, much of that music is still going to sound really good, even through Spotify. Although I prefer Apple's compression and normalization because for some reason their algorithm just treats the music better, gets it closer to what I recorded, doesn't squash it as much. But you can also change the settings to what's called lossless. Lossless meaning not compressed, so waves, AIFFs. Lossy, MP3 is a lossy file because you're losing something in the compression. I'm not going to do this, but you could go into your Spotify and say, make it lossless. It uses a lot more data. If you prefer the imperfections of vinyl, or in my case, cassettes, and want to call your own personal listening experience superior because of that, you have every right. It's just a sum of what I said before. But that in no way proves that vinyl is better. In fact, there's no question in my mind, having been a huge fan of CDs, that all things being equal and done equally well, digital is just far superior, or at least has the capability to be so if we render and use it properly, right? Final conclusion, don't be a Luddite. Don't be an asshole. Don't romanticize the past. Overall, just let yourself and everyone enjoy the music however we all want to. Just let go, because your standards are false. What a negative way to end. Thank you for watching this. If you disagree with me and you have seen studies that say vinyl is superior to digital or whatever, throw them my way. I'm happy to have that conversation with anybody. And I will see you next week.